An estimated 152 million children are being put to work around the world. Hard manual labour in mines, in fields, on family farms. In Africa, 1 in 5 kids are involved in child labour. Girls are especially vulnerable. The number of children at work is set to dramatically worsen because of the pandemic. As it wreaks havoc on family incomes, many parents could put their kids to work. More than 1 billion children in 130 countries have been affected by school closures, and child labour has risen in line as schoolgates bang shut.
The Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development has told DW that children are paying the largest price in this pandemic. Director for Education and Skills, Andreas Schleicher, praises the countries that have managed to keep schools open.
We need to be aware of the high social costs that school closures have for children. And that's why, I value countries, like France and Italy and to some extent even Spain that, despite very difficult pandemic contexts, have given education absolute priority.
India allowed schools to reopen in October, but some children will only head back now due to a staggered resumption of classes. Many children in India's villages may not return at all. We travelled to Uttar Pradesh.
Asad Rehman started apprenticing 6 weeks ago at this furniture shop in a village in Uttar Pradesh. The shy 12-year-old has been half-heartedly listening to instructions. He's clearly not enjoying it.
I want to go back to school, meet my friends. I don't want to work here.
But he doesn't really have an option. Nor does his younger brother Asad, who joined him here a few days ago. Both are following their father's instructions. Abdur Rehman is out of work himself. With schools closed for nearly a year now due to the coronavirus, he has given up hope their education will secure them work. Rehman says he's only looking out for their future.
Schools have been closed. They were studying, but they aren't doing anything now. We've asked them to work out of desperation so that they can learn something, hopefully a livelihood. If schools reopen and they leave work, we'll lose out. If they stay, it helps us survive. There's no advantage in going to school now.
The state government has just announced that junior classes are set to resume. But Asad and Asjad may need to stay at work to support their family. High school classes resumed back in October, but children younger than 15 years have hardly studied for the better part of a year. At best, they while away their time playing with their friends. At worst, they are forced into labor or are married off. Kutubuddin Chaudhry has worried endlessly about this, especially about the 400 children who attended his school. His class is much smaller now. He just helps his own daughters with their studies. Private schools like Chaudhry's educate close to half of India's children, often for very little money. Now, his own school's survival is at stake. Chaudhry waived his 100 rupee or approximately €1 monthly fee during the lockdown. He still fears that many can't afford to continue sending their children.
Most of the children are accompanying their parents to work. I fear 70% of them will drop out. We try to appeal to the parents to keep educating their kids, but they just say, if we don't have money, how are we supposed to send our children to school?
The lack of resources also rules out online education, Chaudhry says. If parents already can't afford a nominal fee, how can they pay for multiple smartphones for all the children at home? Education has not been a priority in his village, he says, and it had been an uphill battle even before the lockdown hit. Chaudhry is excited to see the children again soon, but he is also realistic. He knows that even if just a quarter of them show up, he can count it as a victory.
Ifat Idris is an expert on child labour in South Asia and joins us from the University of Birmingham in the UK. What's causing this huge jump in child labour during the pandemic?
Well, thank you for having me. I think it's all the effects of the pandemic are also drivers of child labour. So the pandemic is causing an economic shock across the world, but it's particularly felt in developing countries. It's causing a rise in poverty. It's closing schools, which traditionally protect children from child labour. It's causing even less enforcement of child labour laws and regulation, and it's meant that civil society organisations can't protect children and monitor them. So for all those reasons, the pandemic is leading to a rise in child labour.
What about the checks and balances? You mentioned schools there and regulations, but are the checks and balances simply gone out the window in this pandemic?
Well, checks and balances in developing countries tend to be weak anyway because of limited government capacity. So, as I said, employers now have more of a free rein to use children and to exploit them because government's attention is focused on dealing with the pandemic, and civil society organisations are not able to carry out the protective role that they normally would. But schools, I think schools are the real significant sort of protector of children, and that has been removed. When you take kids out of schools in developing countries, you greatly increase their risk of being forced into work.
Just briefly, of course, sending these kids into work rather than to school limits their prospects. What does it do? What's the impact on the world, on the global economy?
Well, it's kind of like, I think about it as if you sort of throw a stone in water and you see ripple effects. So child labour has the same kind of ripple effect, which you know spreads outward. So the child themselves, they're affected because they can't study. They're exposed to physical labour, often physical abuse, verbal abuse, even sexual abuse. But in the long term, that child then grows up to be in low-paid work, to be unemployed, to be doing hazardous work. And critically, child labourers grow up into adults who then send their own children out to work. And so you get this intergenerational cycle of poverty, child labour, and that impacts collectively as a society and as a country. That greatly hampers economic growth, development, and that then poverty, underdevelopment, those are both major contributory factors to all kinds of other problems like armed violence, conflict, radicalization, extremism, illegal trafficking, illegal migration, human trafficking, and those have consequences for everyone. Yeah. But I think, you know, the point I really want to stress is that, you know, we need to address, people in the developed world need to address this problem, not just because down the road it will come back to hit us here, but because we have a moral responsibility to do so. These are children. Children have the right to, you know, a future and to be secure and safe and have opportunities. And we all need to support them in doing that.
And as you pointed out there, that the longer-term effects are even longer than one would expect. Ifat Idris, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Now it's that part of the show where Derek Williams fields your questions on the coronavirus.
So what do we currently know about when the pandemic actually started?
More than we did at this time last year, but not a whole lot more. A recent WHO mission that spent weeks in China investigating the origins of the pandemic came to a few unsurprising conclusions. The first was that its members agreed that SARS-CoV-2 had originated in bats, which other experts have more or less been saying the whole time. The second was that it believed the virus had jumped to humans via an unidentified second species, which is more information that's pretty old hat. Although they did say that they suspected it might be a small mammal, which was a specification that was sort of new, I guess. The mission also said it considered it extremely unlikely that SARS-CoV-2 had somehow escaped from a Wuhan lab that specializes in bat viruses, although that assessment remains pretty controversial. Really, for me, the most interesting takeaway was this.
We can also agree that we have found evidence of wider circulation of the virus in December. It was not just only a cluster outbreak in the Huanan market, but the virus was also circulated outside of the markets.
That's new. Up until now, the working hypothesis was that COVID-19 first struck at a wet market in Wuhan around the beginning of December of 2019. But if it was already in wider circulation in the city at that point, that means a couple of things. First, that the wet market wasn't ground zero. And then, of course, that we have to push back the timeline of the original zoonotic jump a while. Although a few studies looking at how the virus has evolved say the earliest date their models predict for a possible jump is October of 2019. So we learned something from the WHO experts, maybe not all that earth-shaking, but interesting. And to be fair, no one expected the mission to figure out everything about the pandemic's origins in a couple of weeks. The wheels of this kind of scientific detective work turn very slowly.
And as we heard earlier, the pandemic has put the welfare of children around the world in peril. The smiles behind the masks speak volumes, and education is a powerful weapon to secure their futures. Germany's daycare centres and elementary schools are open again after 2 months. Wales' youngest pupils are returning in the first step towards reopening schools. And in Israel, where vaccination rates are high, elementary school and the last 2 years of high school classes have resumed in towns with contagion rates under control. Thanks for watching, stay safe, and see you again soon.